All right, good morning, everyone. We are going to get started. Thank you all for joining us this morning for this town hall meeting for the Geary 19th Avenue Subway and Regional Connections Study. We're very glad you're here. We would like to start by letting everyone know that we have Spanish and Cantonese language support this morning, and we have our two wonderful interpreters joining us. Welcome to Martine, who will be translating into Spanish, and Echo, who will be translating into Cantonese. Martine and Echo?
Thank you, Jesse. Muchas gracias, Jesse. Aquí soy intérprete para la mañana de hoy. Voy a estar interpretando en simultáneo el resto de la sesión. Para acceder a mis servicios van a poder hacer clic en la parte inferior de su pantalla, en donde están los tres puntitos. Seleccionan la parte de interpretación y luego el idioma español y me escucharán a mí durante toda la sesión. Muchísimas gracias, que lo disfruten. Thank you, Jesse.
好，多謝 Jess 嚇。今日咧，我哋呢個會議咧係有呢個廣東話嘅，仲有西班牙語嘅翻譯嘅。所以如果你想通過廣東話嚟聽今日嘅會議咧，你可以撳一撳陣間打開一個地球儀嘅呢個咁嘅標示咧，然後揀呢個中文Chinese 就可以聽到攻讀呢個廣東話嘅呢個同傳噶啦。好，多謝，Thank you。
Thank you both. Good morning again, everyone. My name is Jesse Kaler, and I serve as the Rail Program Manager at the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. The Transportation Authority is leading this study in partnership with the SFMTA and the San Francisco Planning Department. I want to welcome you all. I will be facilitating this morning's discussion about this planning effort. As we begin, we have a few housekeeping notes, which I will ask our colleague Brittany Chan to speak to.
Thanks, Jesse. So before we dive into the presentation today, just want to go over a few quick notes. We're going to be recording the meeting, so anyone who couldn't make it can watch it later. And we'll be posting the recording to the project website at sfcta.org/Geary19th. And if you have any questions during the presentation, go ahead and use the Q&A button on Zoom to submit your questions. That helps us keep track of the questions and get to as many of them as we can. And if you don't see the Q&A button right away on your toolbar, try clicking the More button at the bottom of your screen. And I'll go ahead and pass it over to Andy to kick us off.
Thanks, Brittany, and thank you, Jesse. And thank you to our interpreters this morning. So thanks again for everyone spending time with us on this beautiful Saturday morning. It's great to see so much interest once again in this work. As Jesse and Brittany mentioned, I'm Andrew Heidel, Principal Planner with the San Francisco County Transportation Authority and serve as the project manager for this work. It's been over a year since we last had an update. And while I do recognize a couple names today as well, for the sake of those that are new, I'll start with a quick refresher on the history and background of this study and project. Then I'm excited to be able to share some findings from this phase of work as we look to finalize this and prepare our final report. As Jesse mentioned, we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. And as Brittany shared, it would be easiest for us to make sure we get to everyone's questions if you could drop those in the Q&A box. As I mentioned, diving right in, let's start with a quick refresher on the genesis of this effort and what we've been up to. As most of you probably know, the concept of a subway under Geary Boulevard has been discussed for many decades, going back to the original planning studies for the BART system and beyond. Since then, a number of studies and plans have consistently identified the need for a better connection between the West Side and downtown San Francisco, including San Francisco's Four Corridors Plan, the picture in the upper right there, the city's 2016 subway vision, and through multiple citywide planning processes, including the Transportation Authority's countywide San Francisco Transportation Plan. Throughout these studies, the needs of riders have been consistent: faster trips, less crowding, better connections, and maintaining a state of good repair of the system we have. But these years of work have also evolved our understanding of potential solutions. In this case, aligning a Geary subway with a new Transbay rail crossing in the east and along 19th Avenue towards a connection in San Mateo County to the south allows the project to act as a broader part of a regional East Bay to Peninsula connection, while also serving parts of San Francisco that are not well connected to the regional transit network today. These needs and benefits were highlighted most recently in the 2024 update to the California State Rail Plan, produced by the California State Transportation Agency, which identifies connecting Western San Francisco into the statewide rail network as a long-term priority. This current phase of work has picked up where the last San Francisco countywide transportation plan left off, and has worked to refine the case for moving the Geary 19th Avenue subway forward, while also developing a roadmap for next steps. So planning for these kinds of generational investments is a multi-year, multi-step process. To identify a preferred alternative, that's the actual routing of the subway, where station locations might go, and what kinds of trains would actually run in the subway. Much more technical work and community conversations will need to happen. But that's why we started now with our current initial phase, where we've reconfirmed the case for the project and are working to lay out the roadmap through future phases and steps, the relatively modest investment, time, and resources up front that will help us advise the public and elected officials about how and when to proceed as future phases grow in size and cost, as shown on the illustration. Our goal at the conclusion of each of these phases, each of these blocks you see on the screen, is to know enough to feel comfortable committing the resources needed to advance to the subsequent phase. And so, to be clear again, we're not looking to draw those lines on a map or make decisions about what a preferred alternative might be in this phase, nor, to be honest, have we done the technical work or outreach that would allow us to do this. This will come in the following alternatives analysis and investment program prioritization in that defining the project box here on the screen. But we want to recognize that it's important to prompt conversations around the ingredients that would lead us to a successful project early. Before we go any further, a critical issue that you may have heard about that I do want to recognize we are facing today is the transit fiscal cliff. This is an issue you'll likely hear more about over the coming year as San Francisco and the region weigh how to bolster transit funding to address operating shortfalls. As we just discussed, planning, design, and funding of large projects like a new subway takes significant time, and we see advancing this work now as important to lay the groundwork for confirming our capital priorities and securing local, regional, state, and federal funding that will be required to deliver the project. If we wait until our system is bursting at the seams, we'll already be decades behind. So doing this work now is a commitment to San Francisco's long-term future. Plus, despite the disruptions brought on by the pandemic and the changes we've seen since that time with respect to San Francisco's population, travel patterns, and the way we live, San Francisco remains an attractive place to live and work. The assumptions about the future underpinning our planning work are aligned with regional projections, which show that San Francisco is expected to grow with 29% more jobs and 50% more residents by 2050. I will say we are just starting to understand from a data perspective what post-pandemic travel patterns look like. The assumptions we've built into this study will need to be revisited and revised over time to make sure that the benefits continue as changes occur. We've also incorporated into our work the great feedback and questions that we heard during our online town halls and community group meetings throughout 2024 and 2025, along with our online survey. People were very interested. We were excited to see a lot of replies with over 2,400 responses. And the feedback in the online survey mirrored what we heard most frequently in our in-person conversations as well. People are excited about the project and they understand its need. People's questions and concerns focused around cost and schedule. How can we find a way to move this work forward more quickly, and how any potential construction might affect streets and neighborhoods, including residents and businesses? In our first round of outreach, we also shared for feedback our high-level framework for thinking about the benefits of building a Geary 19th Avenue subway. So as our last bit of review, I'll touch on these at a high level because you'll see these themes come through in how we share the results. First, our first bullet point here, how does experience improve for travelers? Will this investment help make transit easier, faster, and more attractive for more trips? Second, understanding that growth is planned for San Francisco, how can we expect the project to serve both current needs as well as those that could arise from that growth? Can we ensure that benefits to existing residents, including those that have been historically disadvantaged or excluded, are shared equitably? And third, can the project make contributions to local, regional, and statewide goals that might be beyond the scope of any one action, but require everything we do to move in the right direction? With that framework in mind, we set out to identify what key decisions that planners, engineers, community members, and elected leaders would likely need to make as the project advances. And as importantly, what doors might be opened or closed by making those decisions. So I'll get into these in a little bit more detail, but as a reminder, once again, these are not decisions that will or can be made in this phase. What we're doing here is identifying an initial set of areas where there are clear options and asking for agreement that these are indeed those key decisions so we can prepare the analysis and engagement that will help us move forward. So the study is proposing that these are a list of important high-level decisions that have significant implications for later planning and design work. In many cases, these decisions are interrelated. If a project goes down a certain path on routing, for example, it might impact the technologies that are on the table, which might impact the ability to connect service directly, what we call through running, to the East Bay or San Mateo County. So please don't think of these as an ordered checklist. Each piece will impact the others on the screen and will require all of us to weigh priorities amongst them. But running through quickly what's on the screen here, and I'll touch on more in detail on the following slides, but how does the project connect to the regional network? Do trains through run? What benefits, implications, or drawbacks does through running have versus a passenger connection only? What neighborhoods and areas within San Francisco should be served directly? We've identified a couple of discrete options in downtown that I'll share, but there's more of a universe with many options in how to transition between Geary and 19th. What train technologies are best suited for a project like this? Those choices will influence performance and station spacing, but also could be, again, directly related to the regional connectivity question. So let's start with that regional connectivity. The mix of policy, technology, and coordinated decision-making. And we consider maximizing regional connectivity to the extent possible to be mutually beneficial both to this project and the regional system as a whole. We do understand that there are ways to achieve that beyond through running trains, but as we'll see in the next section, through running does have real anticipated benefits over a passenger transfer. Pointing again to the state rail plan here, that document echoed this understanding, pointing to a desire to bring Western San Francisco within the reach of the statewide rail network, either directly or via high-quality connections. As we advance through this decision, we'll also need to keep other agency and operator plans in mind. BART and Capitol Corridor are advancing under planning for a new Transbay Rail crossing as Link 21. Caltrain is recently electrified and considering their business plan along with high-speed rail. Getting into the details downtown, we have two potential routing options paired with two of the technology concepts that were explored in Link 21. The Link 21 BART technology concept, coming up 3rd Street, could pair with a downtown San Francisco routing directly under Geary, as shown on the left. Or the Link 21 standard gauge technology concept could, flagging with a somewhat significant set of modifications or expansions to the Salesforce Transit Center, through run trains to Geary, but via Civic Center rather than Union Square, giving the curve radiuses required. Additionally, a BART technology crossing that's under Howard, coming in parallel to Market Street, could also use this routing. As I mentioned, connecting the Geary and 19th Avenue segments has more options and less certainty. With a more easterly alignment, potentially turning at or near Masonic, the subway could directly serve areas with existing and established residential density, as well as important regional destinations like UCSF Parnassus. These areas are also already served by a higher density of transit than points more further west and enjoy relatively short travel times to and from downtown today. By continuing further west under Geary before making a turn to the south, the subway would have the opportunity to not only serve destinations like Japantown, Kaiser Hospital, and USF, as all alignments would, but could also directly serve areas not well linked to regional transit today, shortening journey times to and from the Richmond. A number of options in the middle would help support adopted plans and policies by serving housing growth areas while still enabling faster regional connections to places like Golden Gate Park, the Inner Sunset, and UCSF again, all of which draw regional visitors and local trips. This is also where potential phasing options could the project could be developed and studied further. For example, future studies could potentially define and explore the option of splitting the entire subway project into segments, each with their own ability to deliver benefits, and then anticipating completion of the entire alignment. For the southern project terminus, we considered options to create either a passenger connection or a through running opportunity, depending on technology. Far north is the Daly City BART station, and as far south as the Colma BART station. For the purposes of our analysis, we assume Daly City as the tie-in, but understand that to do that, physical improvements may need to eventually stretch further south into San Mateo County. At this location will also need to be important multi-jurisdictional conversations around station design, access, and station area planning. The existing road network and topography here present both challenges and opportunities for the project itself and these related factors. Closely related to that question is the technology for the subway. So this project is considering modes that can provide the frequent high-capacity metro-like service that the demand in the corridor requires, and is prioritizing modes that are interoperable with, that's again, could permit through running with the regional network. So as we know today, that's BART technology. Most folks are familiar with that, broad gauge, heavy metro, and regional rail. I think it's important to note that for this corridor, we shouldn't think of that as Capital Corridor or even Caltrain electrified trains, but something more single level, multi-door, again, meeting that frequent high capacity metro-like service, though could still operate on the regional rail network. The study does include other potential technologies like Muni Metro, our existing standard gauge light rail, or even new technologies like automated ORT. Implications of train technology will impact station location and station spacing, design speed, how we integrate with the regional network, of course, and where a maintenance facility could be sited and sized. So what do all these questions mean with respect to what performance results and improvements in the three key areas we talked about earlier? Traveler experience, supporting growth and economic success, and those larger project policy goals. We tested those key questions while identifying and exploring other considerations to understand what the subway project's range of benefits might be. We're happy to see improvements across all three of those key areas, and I'll get into some more detail about that in a moment. We also identified what we'll recommend as other critical building blocks to advance as part of or in parallel to additional project planning, things like funding, land use, how connecting transit works, and what other supportive policies can help maximize the benefits we see and perhaps help pay for the project, as I'll talk about as well. On the next few slides, I'll share what we think the key takeaways for planners, community members, and decision makers are going forward. So first, we believe the overall case for the project is and remains promising and has the potential to be an integral part of the regional and statewide rail system. We propose that the study recommends San Francisco should continue to lead and advance planning for the project to prepare for the future, with the knowledge that maximizing project benefits also creates opportunity to create value in travel time savings for travelers, the accessibility and value of land, and economic activity and productivity, and that capturing and leveraging that value will be critical in underpinning the funding for the project, given its high capital cost. More on that in a moment. We also note that there are trade-offs. It's important to deliver benefits to existing residents and businesses while mitigating potential effects such as displacement. And it will be important to have policies in place to support residents and businesses during and well after construction of any project. Next, we've confirmed that regional connectivity is fundamental towards delivering the most amount of benefits to travelers and communities. So while, of course, the project does perform well as a San Francisco-only subway, it performs much better when it's integrated with the region's rail network. These benefits increase not only for San Franciscans, but for travelers across the region. Put some numbers to that. So depending on the route, a San Francisco-only subway could see between 160 and 180,000 trips per day, matching today's BART daily system-wide ridership as a point of reference. That could increase, though, to over 300,000 trips per day with through-running regional connectivity. So these abstract numbers are good, but to make it about an individual traveler's experience, some trips to, from, and through San Francisco could get shorter by as much as 20 minutes with those regional connections as well, particularly those to and from the west side and to Oakland or San Francisco Airport in the peninsula. Our same analysis showed that multiple design options can deliver benefits. So as the project advances, clear input from community members will be important to balance with technical considerations to select routes and station locations. It's important to note that project decisions have the potential to drive the ultimate cost of the project. We currently estimate the full cost to be somewhere between $20 and $30 billion in today's dollars. In future phases, we'll also need to consider what project phasing might be, as I mentioned earlier, considering if there is an initial segment that can deliver some benefits at a smaller cost while still anticipating the full build out of the project. Give some examples of that. There's only small differences in overall system performance between those different downtown options we talked about, or the ones I discussed about how to connect between Geary and 19th Ave. But that obscures the fact of the top line ridership numbers that who benefits can vary significantly depending on what areas are served. So it's important to consider that connecting transit will also play an important role in the project, and that travel times and accessibility can still be improved even for people not in immediate walking distance of the station. Speaking to our passenger experience, regional and statewide climate and equity goals, we found that the project moves the needle in the right direction in each of these versus a future where the project isn't built. And the good news is that our analysis shows that the people who benefit the most are those who live in communities that have been historically disadvantaged or excluded from this kind of project planning work. To give some examples of that, the project delivers travel time savings. For this illustration, the measure here is the number of jobs that a San Francisco household could reach by a 45-minute trip on transit. For the average San Francisco household, that goes up by about 6% or 45,000 jobs on a San Francisco only project, and up to 57,000 or a 9% increase with those regional connections. Residents of San Francisco's equity priority community households gain even more transit job access, with 57 to 72,000 additional jobs accessible within 45 minutes. We also see reduced vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas emissions, a 4% reduction in both. That's 400,000 miles per day. And just to frame that, it's very surprising to see any individual project that moves the needle more than 1% on something like that. I'll also note that residents of equity priority communities represent about 20% of new transit boardings, but experience 50% of the travel time savings. So as we think about what it will take to deliver the project, it became evidence that the benefits will need to be regionally significant to attract the full package of local, regional, state, and federal funds that will be required. That includes decisions about the project itself. We already touched on integration with the regional network a few times, but also other supportive policies adopted by the city and neighborhoods like land use, parking, and transit connections. We do expect this project to perform well under traditional federal criteria, shown here on the screen, and major transit investments must secure support, not just from an array of local sponsors, but also funders at that regional, state, and federal level. To position a project for success, our local strategy typically comes down to the local financial commitment and maximizing benefits. The best way for a project to be competitive is to demonstrate how we can afford it locally by providing that local match. Local funding is a critical part of this process. So we'll need to think creatively about new places to look for that funding, as existing local sources are not enough to fund a project of this size. I mentioned earlier about the project delivering value in terms of travel time, land value, and economic activity. So the project will need to think about whether there are ways to recoup a meaningful portion of that value to contribute to the project. These and other sources are also likely to be competitive, meaning that we should make decisions that maximize performance and, of course, minimize cost. Drawing a connection or nexus between the value the subway project would deliver and potential sources of funding will be important. So the Geary 19th Avenue subway is expected to drive significant value creation, and areas in San Francisco, Bay Area, and the state of California have a history of developing innovative funding approaches around. Some examples of those potential methods are on the screen here. For example, are there ways to create a win-win by reducing vehicle congestion and funding transit improvements through a road user charge, as has shown success in New York and Chicago? Can we explore methods like a benefit district or joint development to bring some of the expected increase in land value back to the project? To be clear, none of these ideas are certain at this point, but it's important to further develop and explore these options as the project develops and to understand where certain techniques can play a role in making the subway a reality. And finally, moving the project forward will require a mix of robust community input alongside technical development, planning, and engineering to help inform those project choices. Continued engagement and support from people like yourself and your neighbors and friends, and importantly, active outreach to other people who might not be able to attend events like these will be critical. So where do we go from here? For this study, we are completing our outreach in March of this month and anticipate bringing a final report to the Transportation Authority Community Advisory Committee and Transportation Authority Board later this spring. Beyond the study itself, the project will need to be evaluated and prioritized in local and regional processes. The San Francisco Transportation Plan is the 30-year investment plan for our transportation revenues and includes all operators and networks serving San Francisco. It's one of the Transportation Authority's core responsibilities as San Francisco's designated congestion management agency. The SFTP investment plan and vision plan will establish investment priorities for the transportation system for the next 30 years and position San Francisco projects for federal, state, and regional funds within Plan Bay Area, which is developed by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, or MTC. Projects seeking federal funds or approval need to be in Plan Bay Area, and San Francisco's SFTP provides our input to MTC for this purpose, as both plans are adopted updated every 4 years. As I mentioned, we expect the project to perform well in these processes, and the next full-scale San Francisco Transportation Plan can help prioritize this and other major capital recommendations, like a central subway extension. There's currently a minor mid-cycle update underway to the San Francisco Transportation Plan, which we call SFTP+. This minor update of SFTP Plus will continue to support the development of the transit strategy priorities, Geary 19th being one of them, through inclusion of planning and project development phases in the investment plan. We won't prioritize the capital projects in SFTP Plus, but in the next major update, when we will have more to evaluate. As we work towards these milestones, we encourage people to participate in the SFTP Plus process, which has a round of outreach coming up, and discuss our investment and vision scenarios later this spring. So just a plug to visit sfcta.org/SFTP to learn more about those processes and a chance to participate. That concludes my presentation for this morning. Turn things back over to Jesse to facilitate a discussion and Q&A. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Andy, and thank you everyone for the great questions that we are seeing come in to the Q&A. If anyone has questions, please, if possible, use the Q&A function. It'll just help us endeavor to get to as many of them as possible. I'll start, though, with one that has to do with funding and whether this study has considered the benefit of congestion pricing or congestion fees.
Sure, I'll take that one, Jesse. Yes, I think, as I mentioned on one of the slides about being able to capture some of the value that the project may create, there is an opportunity to think about the nexus between congestion reduction with vehicles and on surface streets and better public transit through projects like this, but also through other projects the city and county might pursue, or operational support or things like that. So the Transportation Authority has been leading a study on congestion pricing that is currently paused as we consider the impacts of the COVID pandemic and the economic recovery that follows. But as each advance, we want to make sure they're in conversation with each other, and it becomes part of both the transportation demand picture as well as the transportation funding picture moving forward.
All right, we have a somewhat technical question, which warms the heart of some of us practitioners. So this commenter is asking, saying that they believe the broader, wider gauge BART trains have a larger or gentler minimum turning radius than typical standard gauge trains, such as Caltrain's new electrified fleet, and reference specifically the tight turn on the Caltrain system near the terminus at 4th and King. Do you want to comment on turning radii, Andy?
Sure. So as I mentioned in the presentation, this phase of work didn't do any detailed engineering work or analysis But we did take a look at some of the design standards for the various technologies that are under consideration. And when we sort of plated our bubble that you saw on Geary 19th and through downtown, we assumed the worst case of all of the technologies. So what is our most conservative estimate we can make in terms of station size, turn radii, grades and slopes, particularly important as well in a city with San Francisco's topography. And I believe actually that BART has a tighter turn radius possible than standard gauge rail because of the length of the vehicles and the assumed design speed. So the standard gauge regional rail would need to have gentler curves as well as gentler slopes than a BART technology would. Of course, the light rail options would have even tighter potential radii and potentially steeper slopes. As you see, they operate on the streets of San Francisco today with each of those.
Thanks, Andy. I'll just briefly note for those who have ridden BART into Oakland, past West Oakland into downtown Oakland, there is a quite tight turn in the BART system. Now, BART typically does not like turns that tight, but it is possible for the system to have relatively tight turns despite the wider separation of rails. Andy, we had a question about to add some elaboration on a question that we received on Thursday at this week's town hall earlier this week, and it is with respect to consideration of a spur to the outer Richmond and asking about the consideration of density levels to the west, as well as considerations for maintenance. And this commenter asks or poses the point that there is reason to expect higher density in this area for reasons such as SB 375 and related measures. And as to the maintenance area, neither the N Judah nor the El Taraval serve the outer Sunset with such facilities. What would it take to consider further extension to the outer Richmond?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, as I mentioned on Thursday, for the benefit of those folks who don't enjoy hearing from us twice, there's a couple factors at play thinking about a stub or a spur further west in the Richmond than 19th Avenue. And so the first, as this questioner asked, is that we did observe that demand does tend to drop off west of that point. Some of that related to density, some of it related to travel patterns. And I do think there is an opportunity to have sort of a yes and conversation about that. I'll note that our underlying assumptions, as I mentioned in the presentation, are consistent with the regional assumptions and with the recently adopted San Francisco housing element, which steers growth along transit corridors, particularly in Western San Francisco. So it is reflective of what capacity would be anticipated under a full build out of that plan, which still has those issues. The other piece is operational. And so as this person noted, the existing Muni light rail lines do provide service to the Sunset all the way to the beach and the zoo without those maintenance facilities. This has been a conversation we've had with BART and Caltrain and some other operators, particularly those that have inherited legacy systems, that what's out there in the world today might not be what one would want to produce today. So we did have pretty explicit conversations with the Link 21 and the BART and Capital Corridor teams about how far they would be willing to get from a maintenance facility. And some of the progress we made on that was that further than before, I think it would be that still having access to the yard and facilities at Colma or the East Bay facilities is good, but if a train breaks down or thinking about the time needed to start service, get trains to the end of the line in the morning or get them back to the yard at the end of service in the evening is an operational factor as well that is balanced with maintenance needs. So for all of those reasons and above, as well as the desire to make sure that the project could be connected on both ends, is why the prior planning work, the transit corridor strategy in 2021 and Connect SF and San Francisco Transportation Plan in 2022 focused on this Geary and 19th connection.
So because you raised the issue of the longer term growth projections that underpin some of the technical analysis, we had a question as follows. Has AI's impact, artificial intelligence's impact on labor market over the long term within the region been incorporated into the projections for growth?
Ooh, that's a juicy question. I think the short answer is not really. That's a pretty new set of factors. As I mentioned, we're still grappling with post-pandemic, if we want to call it that, travel patterns, which themselves are different than what we observed in 2019 or early months of 2020. And so in many ways, we'll have to see how that plays out. There's AI, there's autonomous mobility, there's all sorts of factors in the world that are potentially, I won't say seismic, but important changes in how people get around and if they get around. Um, I, I think one of the reasons that if I can scroll back, apologies for moving very quickly through some of these slides, um, thinking about the overall arc of planning for the project. Um, each of these blocks represent one or more discrete decisions that elected officials and the public will need to make about committing resources moving forward. And I think it's important for us to understand as some of these emerging technologies and policies and factors happen, is that we don't just proceed on autopilot with what this study found or what the immediate next phase will find in the coming years, but that we check those assumptions and check that the benefits are still being provided that we expect before committing those resources to move forward. So we're proposing to lay out a process that puts those checks along the way in place, transparency, decision making, and resource commitment at each step.
Thanks, Andy. I'm just going to add that given this question also referenced the labor market, that transit projects in San Francisco, while the sort of traditional work commute is a piece of the demand puzzle, there are many types of travelers and riders that use the system within San Francisco, and that's in fact in part why transit systems within San Francisco, including Muni, tended to recover from the pandemic more quickly than the more commute-focused services like Caltrain and BART. And so regardless of the exact complexion of work-focused travel in the future, we generally have confidence in the overall level of demand for getting around well into the future.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Jesse. I'll also add that the the way this project is shaped in its current proposal is hitting those kinds of markets that have recovered, sometimes beyond 2019 ridership, the neighborhood to neighborhood connections in San Francisco. So routes like the 22 and 28, for example, have seen really great service recovery versus, as Jesse mentioned, some of the routes to and from downtown that have not seen as fast of a return to ridership.
So while we're on the topic of thinking about future demand levels, we have another question from another participant about the service frequency assumptions that we use. Sort of how frequently do we assume that service would be on the corridor? And it specifically is asking about considerations for ridership on local focused service versus regional. And they go on to say, presumably through running could compete for space with Caltrain and high-speed rail and only offer a few trips per hour, whereas local service could run every few minutes. I am wondering if the lower ridership estimate for local-only service is due to using the same frequencies as regional service. There's a lot to unpack there, Andy.
Yes. So I think I'll start. I'll do that one a little bit backwards. So our ridership analysis in this phase of work is technology agnostic. So we assumed a station spacing of about a half mile on the Geary segment and a mile on the 19th Avenue segment. And the performance characteristics of the trains in terms of speed, acceleration, deceleration, dwell time were also consistent across. And in many ways, that's reflective of reality, as these folks who have ridden electric Caltrain have experienced the acceleration and deceleration is much closer to BART than it was to the diesel-hauled locomotives of just the past few years. And so rather than try to fine-tune that, we assumed the same performances. So I think the second part, or the prior part of the question about connecting into a regional system, needing to define what slots are available for trains or how many trains could actually be fed to the Geary corridor. I think that ultimately may be a key differentiator between the BART and regional rail technology. So I'll take a moment to recognize that Link 21 has made a recommendation of standard gauge regional rail technology in the crossing. For the purposes of our evaluation, we evaluated both BART and standard gauge regional rail. I think our perspective shares some potential concern about the availability of slots on the remainder of the regional rail network because of capacity restraints in the East Bay or on the peninsula that could potentially limit the Transbay crossing. That does not necessarily prevent a Geary subway alignment from operating operationally independently and adding additional Geary trains that don't necessarily, so maybe every other train goes across the bay, for example. For the BART technology, our service assumptions were effectively the same as the existing BART tube. And so that means that our assumptions for all the technologies, as I mentioned earlier, because we did not differentiate, are all effectively 3 to 5 minute headways across each of those. So the short answer, do the ridership numbers differentiate based on technology because of frequency assumptions, is no. They vary because of the type and connectivity of the transfers.
Thanks, Andy. And I'll just briefly add, in part because there's another comment that pertains to the potential for automated light rail transit, which if you've been to Vancouver, British Columbia, you'd be familiar with the SkyTrain system. And as Andy noted, while our study at this course initial level of planning, the forecasting we did was representing options for BART or regional rail as a way to have an initial envelope of potential ridership. Other modes, such as automated light rail or Muni Metro, have somewhat different potential service profiles. The limitation, of course, with contemplating something like SkyTrain in San Francisco is that it would not be capable of through running. At the same time, those systems do offer the possibility for shorter or tighter frequencies, more frequent trains, due to the sort of configuration of those systems. And some of those more nuanced distinctions between modes would be anticipated as questions to work technically and with the public on in future phases of planning. All right. Okay, we have an interesting question about ownership or operational responsibility for the project in the future. And this commenter poses the question, is the underlying expectation or assumption that this project would be owned and operated by Muni? Or if a wide gauge were to be recommended, would that implicate ownership by BART?
Jump in if you have a different or additional opinion on this, Jesse. I think we did not do an exploration of ownership and operation in this phase of work. I think it's not wrong to make assumptions about who current operators are with respect to the various technologies. The regional rail option or standard gauge regional rail compatible option is perhaps the most open of that question. I don't think the study would necessarily propose creating a 30th or 31st, I'm not sure where we are now, operating agency within San Francisco. But I think it's important to consider that there are delivery methods in place that might separate who constructs and maintains the subway from the agency who might operate the trains through it or be responsible for the staffing and rolling stock itself. So no decisions made in this phase. And I think, as Jesse mentioned at the prior question, something to consider as we move into the following subsequent phases.
So another question we received is one we've received before, and it simply asks, what will the impacts of construction of this subway be on residents and businesses? And are there plans to mitigate such impacts?
You want to take that one, Jesse? Did a great job.
Sure, happy to. I will say that, yes, no construction project this big is free of impact. And of course, we would be working to move forward through each stage to develop mitigation approaches. The good thing about a subway project, as opposed to, for example, something that operates entirely at the surface, is that we would anticipate the project would be tunneled, likely with a tunnel boring machine technology, which would generally limit the surface disruption to those locations where you're constructing station access or ventilation structures that are necessary for fire and life safety. A big part of developing the design and completing the environmental review and approvals will be looking at those impacts, whether they be on traffic, noise, construction, etc. And through the environmental process and the delivery of the project, ensuring that there is a mitigation approach for those impacts and that the any effects on businesses and residents are as best addressed as possible. I will say we did not focus on site-specific considerations in this stage. As Andy noted, we are not yet developing the final lines on maps or exact station locations. So that would be a focus of future phases of advancing the project and a necessary part of potentially preparing it for construction. All right. So another good question that we sometimes get, and it simply says, you referred at the beginning of the presentation that variations of this concept have been under consideration for multiple decades. Are you approaching this work in a meaningfully different way than past studies that would make it more likely for this work to actually move forward?
Yes, I think that is the big underlying idea of a lot of how we are approaching this work here. Starting with this pre-planning phase where we're confirming the benefits of the project and also doing a really clear inventory or trying to do a really clear inventory of what the key decision points and potential delivery mechanisms in terms of funding are to both learn from some of those prior efforts, both in planning as well as some of the recently constructed projects in San Francisco, thinking of Van Ness BRT, El Terraval Light Rail, and importantly, Central Subway, about what went well and what didn't go well as part of those projects. I think as you probably saw through the presentation, one of the biggest challenges for a project of this size has been putting the full funding picture together. The cost estimate is serious. It's no joke, and it's not easy to put together. Part of the difference of approach is that concept of plugging this thing more clearly into being a critical component of the regional travel network. And so benefits that expand beyond San Francisco and to and from San Franciscans, whether that's real or perceived, will hopefully make it easier to attract the interest of some of those outside funders and show that this is going to be important to meeting statewide goals, federal goals, regional goals, and that the investment is not just for San Francisco, but it is an important part of the picture for the region and state as well.
Thanks, Andy. I'll just add a little bit to that. I think that in San Francisco and the Bay Area and across the state for that matter, that we can draw some lessons learned of the ingredients that are necessary to really move a project forward to reality. And those are things through this first phase of work we want to be able to articulate to the public and to decision makers. And those go beyond simply the technical planning to also touch on some of the things Andy mentioned, as well as demonstrations of public support that encourage decision makers to move the project forward into successive phases, funding commitments that demonstrate local financial commitment, whether on a corridor-specific level as well as a citywide, countywide, regional level, where there is skin in the game from San Francisco and the community to support the project moving forward. And then lastly, the performance of the project, which is a key evaluation metric for those other funders like the federal government and the state government, which are supported by parallel land use planning, travel demand management planning, and supportive policies that leverage and maximize the benefit of the project. So It's sort of a multi-ingredient approach that requires additional emphasis and development over time as the project progresses. So we had a question that we touched on, but I do want to state it because it sort of speaks to what we were just speaking to. And the question is, are innovative funding sources being considered? Who on the team is responsible for this aspect of the project? So that's a shared responsibility across the team. We have the good fortune as Transportation Authority staff. I sit in the capital projects team. Andy sits in the planning team. Our agency is also a funding agency. We administer a number of sources and also work with city agencies in the region and the state to do what we call fund programming or prioritization of funding sources. So we bring both some in-house knowledge on innovative funding as well as an ability with our consultant team to reach out to peers who have been successful. I think locally, one of the examples we often look to is the TransBay program down at Salesforce Transit Center and now the Portal Project, which was a very large vision that combined a land value capture mechanism associated with the development you see down there, along with the investment in transportation infrastructure over a series of phases. And of course, there are other examples within the region and beyond that we would increasingly look to. Okay, Andy, we have another somewhat technical question that I'll do my best to synthesize. And the commenter is asking, could we please clarify what specific infrastructure regional connectivity requires beyond, for example, a well-designed interchange at Salesforce Transit Center? Connecting to an existing terminus is, of course, smart design, but I am wary of how waiting on new infrastructure like Link 21 could delay the project and defer benefits to San Franciscans who need it now. Totally hear that there's an opportunity to access more capital with regional connectivity, just trying to get at what the project timeline trade-off might be.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think speaks to both the design of the project and infrastructure as well as some potential phasing and ultimately technology selection, I think. So we did explore with the Link 21 team as part of this project what that project handshake might or could look like. Obviously, they're in very early engineering design phases. We've barely done any beyond checking our assumptions and making sure that as I mentioned, the curves you see here are buildable and realistic. So in the case of BART technology, I think it's pretty straightforward, actually. The color between blue and green here changes at Market Street, but that might not be exactly correct depending on which project comes first. Come back to that point in a second. Each project would likely need some tail tracks to turn trains around depending on what the terminal station would be and could essentially be a stub end. For the regional rail connectivity, as I mentioned, some significant modifications to how trains are anticipated to use the Salesforce Transit Center would be required. As currently planned, the Salesforce Transit Center is accessible from the west or south trains coming from Caltrain. The Link 21 proposal for this includes turning this into a through running station, as you see on the orange arrow here. But as I think another person mentioned, there are capacity restrictions all around here in terms of the platforms at the station, the Caltrain corridor to the south. And so it's likely that an additional set of platforms or an annex under Howard Street. So pretty integrated into the Salesforce Transit Center, but certainly not something that at first blush looks like a cross-platform transfer or a MacArthur type transfer on BART for those that are familiar with that today. That would allow trains to sort of route either to Western San Francisco or down to the peninsula. I do want to come back to the phasing piece. So person mentioned there are trade-offs to waiting for a Transbay connection to come here. I think as we think about the technology options and the technology selections we have on the table as San Francisco, it is possible that a BART Geary subway that could through run to Millbrae and SFO could be built before a Transbay connection because it has access back to the yard and back to the rest of the BART system. A regional rail Geary subway would be on its own. So probably not a great decision for San Francisco to make without a commitment, a pretty clear commitment that Link 21 would deliver on a regional rail crossing. And of course, LRT, ALRT, not being proposed to be regional through running, could proceed on their own timelines as well.
All right, I want to get to a few more questions. Andy, we had a question about comparison of subway to surface light rail, and if that was considered, or
Yes.
when that was considered, or what the trade-offs are.
Sure. So that was actually considered in the phase of work prior to this. So the recommendation that this study is building on is grade separated rail rapid transit. The prior Connect SF and SFTP work in 2021, 2022 did examine, what would maxing out the bus on Geary look like? Would it be able to achieve the level of service and provide the capacity required, as well as an upgrade to surface light rail? And the real big issue that happens in those scenarios is the cross streets. So for example, if we were to go with even the articulated 60-foot buses looking, 20, 30 years into the future, the demand in the corridor is expected to exceed what would take more than one bus per minute to operate. And when you start to get to that level of frequency, while it might be great for a rider, it means that any red light along the corridor at all on the cross streets bunches up the bus, creates big gaps, makes the service unreliable. And so people still need to cross the street on Geary, on foot, on bike, by car, which led us to the conclusion of recommending this grade separated facility.
Andy, we had a couple of questions that refer to or ask the question about potential BART and Muni or multiple modes sharing the project in some capacity, with the commenter pointing to the shared stations on Market Street between those two operators. And they ask, would this allow for both regional and local connections with both BART trains and the local Muni trains?
This is asking about a potential of a Market Street dual level.
Either dual level or shared on the same track.
Yeah, so this study did not take that as an option. I think that some of it is there is a larger expense to building those stations and alignments. The other being that I think that it's possible to achieve the station spacing with the technologies on the table that would address that dual need, as well as thinking about the corridor as one might on Mission Street, where there is a more regionally connected subway underneath, as well as a rapid and local bus up on the surface to serve those short, medium, and long-term or long-distance trips.
We have a question that's asking about land use and development. Specifically, the commenter notes that the 19th Avenue portion of the corridor would be adjacent to the anticipated Stonestown housing development. And have there been efforts to collaborate potentially on a Stonestown stop, or would that wait until the project is further along?
I think a little bit of both. So again, specific stop locations, configurations, etc., are not in this phase, but are in subsequent phases. But we did recognize as a study team the opportunity that presents, particularly with the redevelopment underway. That project is moving more quickly than this one, I will say, through the development agreement process, and has worked with the planning department to secure the initial approvals to move forward with some of that. We did have those discussions to make sure that something like a station at or around Stonestown would not be precluded. So we are happy that that remains an option on the table. And as this project advances and as that project advances, I think we should keep those conversations open.
We had a question about sort of the relative benefits of regional connectivity to the East Bay and to northern San Mateo County. And this commenter indicates that they see a great need for rail connections from western San Francisco to downtown, the airport, and the peninsula, but that they find it surprising that there is a need to connect western San Francisco to the East Bay. Could we prioritize more frequent trips with a focus on the peninsula rather than going across the bay?
So I think of two things here. I can share that our analysis found that of that step up in ridership to the regionally connected options, actually most of it came from connectivity to and from the East Bay. I think there's obviously job centers in Oakland and Emeryville and places that people want to go, educational institutions, et cetera. But there is, also a lot of north-south travel. We recognize there's a market for that between Western San Francisco and Northern San Mateo County. Some of this, I think, is our land use assumptions. I pointed to this around the discussion around how that tie-in at Daly City happens. What are the opportunities for land use station configuration, station access? But yes, I think our analysis did not show that the Peninsula connection was as much of a contributor as the East Bay connection. That said, input about what connections are prioritized and how the project advances, as I mentioned, are going to be an important part of the engagement process. So appreciate that input as well.
We're going to wrap up in a few moments. I'm just checking through the questions to see that we covered as many as we can. We did get a question about whether we have a relationship with the boring company that could entail efficiencies for tunneling of this project. I will note that we have not, in this phase of work, done any detailed work with respect to what we call means and methods of construction for tunneling. Those more design-focused efforts would follow in subsequent phases of planning and design. There's a question I think we covered, but I will just restate it because I know it is on the minds of members of the public and decision makers. And it's given the cost of this project and in view of competition for limited monies, how realistic is funding for this project? I'll just briefly note, as Andy said, that a project at this scale, part of this early phase of planning is to lay out the broad range of potential costs and benefits and the range of potential funding sources. A project at this scale will require support and participation from essentially all levels of government, as well as funding sources that are brought forward with an eye toward a significant investment in this project. And it's part of why we want to take a progressive approach to advancing that understanding in each phase. All right, maybe we will close with this question, which, Andy, you've alluded to in some of your responses, but just again, because many of the participants have had questions about different modes. And the question is, if all options were on the table for this project, whether regional rail, BART, Caltrain, or Amtrak, or your municipal light rail service, which do you think would be the best choice for San Francisco and the Bay Area overall? Which would be the most cost effective? What do you think will be the most likely to get chosen?
How are you going to get me in trouble?
It's a point to what's all to come in all of those good
yes,
questions.
I do think that those are. I will withhold my personal responsibilities as I am on the clock this morning. But I think those are all exactly the key questions that are going to come up in the subsequent phases of work with respect to technology and its selection. There are really clear benefits and trade-offs with each of the options that we have put on the table. Some of them will relate to decisions made by others that San Francisco can have an opinion towards, but can't necessarily be in the full driver's seat. There'll be regional, statewide, important high-level decisions, such as around the technology and any new Trans-Bay rail crossing. So I think that's part of why we strategically left all of the options on the table here to be able to put forth that perspective from a technical analysis perspective and reflective of the feedback we hear in conversations like this, but also allow us to provide input into those larger regional and statewide processes and be able to respond to them as well about, there were some earlier questions about what's the timing of the projects? How do these things start to fit together? Leaving San Francisco the option to make some of those decisions on our own, as well as being able to, as Jesse was saying, demonstrate the fundability and deliverability and support for the project.
Thanks, Andy. You'll forgive me. I do want to just ask one more quick question because
Go
it's
for
very
it.
thoughtful, and I don't want this individual to feel I just missed it as I was flipping through. So this is about, and we got a similar question at Thursday's meeting. Um, it seems like Geary is partly left out of the project as the project turns south and heads toward 19th Avenue. Geary and Clement are amazing commercial corridors that would benefit from rail. Why does the line turn so soon? And maybe Andy, briefly, you could just speak to the broader benefits, even across those options to different parts of the city.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to note that getting fast grade separated, not subject to congestion rail further to Western San Francisco, even if one is not right at a station location, still brings a lot of those both local and regional destinations much closer from a travel time perspective, especially as we think about the frequencies to deliver here. I would say to directly respond to the question, as I mentioned earlier, we have our baseline assumptions about what land use will be well into the future that's reflective of adopted plans and policies, and allows us to consider, where the demand is for a high capacity grade separated rail project. And that demand does seem to reduce the further west we go. Some of that is just, natural geography. A station next to the ocean has a catchment area that is half ocean, and so is more difficult to justify as a full investment. But I know folks aren't necessarily proposing that, so don't want to be hyperbolic. But I think, Jesse, your point about how a regional rail or even locally connected rail arc through Western San Francisco puts a lot of folks within much closer reach of both local and regional destinations. Though a transfer or a little bit of a walk could potentially be required as well.
Thanks, Andy. Well, we're going to wrap up. I want to appreciate everyone who took more than an hour of this beautiful Saturday morning to learn more about this project. I'm always so impressed with how engaged everyone is and what thoughtful and detailed questions everyone asks. We'd really like you all to continue to stay engaged in this work as we complete this phase of work, bring it to the Transportation Authority Board, and prepare for next steps. If for some reason we did not get to your question or one occurs to you after this conversation, please email our project email or go to our website and you'll find a way to contact us there. And again, thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.